Presently, at the Supreme Court, there are three of us who have credentials. I'm pretty much the only one who's there for every argument, or almost every argument. When I first started out, if we were covering a trial, there were usually at least 6 sketch artists. Today in D.C., there's basically just me and Bill Hennessy. And then there's a third who works for AP, but she's very seldom in court.
Hi, it's Steph, and that was the voice of Arthur Lien. Art is a SCOTUS courtroom sketch artist. Not many people can say they have been present in and been able to make record of the Supreme Court of the United States for hearings over the past 40 years. Today, we get a glimpse into Art's world. We'll find out how he got there, how he does sketches in other courts and hearings at the Senate, for example. You'll also get to hear how his path to sketching in the highest court started in the back row of an elementary classroom, that it was not a straight line from that day to today. While you listen, you might want to pull up scotusblog.com or SCOTUSblog on Twitter to see some of his beautiful sketches. Hear about courtroom vantage points, demeanor, the great RBG's callers, running against the clock, his courtroom fantasy, memorable cases, and crazy outbursts. Real quick, thank you to all of you for listening to Another Door Opens and for your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts. To my Patreon supporters, I can't thank you enough for believing in this podcast and choosing to back it. All right, get out your pastels, watercolors, or charcoal, and get into this refreshing conversation with this down-to-earth, talented person who holds a very unique and esteemed position as one of only a few people to sketch the historic events that take place within the Supreme Court of the United States. This is the Another Door Opens podcast, and I'm your host, Stephanie Himango. Here is Art Lien. I just have to say, I have been fascinated by what you do for so long, and I just feel really privileged to be able to ask you all kinds of fun questions today that pertain to your work as a Supreme Court of the United States or SCOTUS courtroom sketch artist. So thank you for saying yes to my request to talk about your work today.
Thank you, Stephanie.
How long have you been a courtroom sketch artist, and has it always been the Supreme Court?
I have been at the Supreme Court almost from the beginning. I started in 1976. I started locally in Baltimore at the trial. Our governor was on trial, but by the next year, I was sketching the Supreme Court.
How did that happen? How did you end up there? Were there many people sort of vying for that type of a position?
There were a lot of sketch artists doing courtroom sketching at that time. After I did the trial of our governor, Mandel, I wrote letters to the 3 networks. There were only 3 in those days. And CBS responded, and they let me try out. They also needed somebody to sketch the U.S. Senate as well as the Supreme Court because there weren't any cameras at that time.
Maryland Governor Marvin Mandel was a defendant in 1977 charged with crimes of mail fraud and racketeering. He was found guilty and sentenced to 4 years in prison, but the decision was later overturned and his sentence commuted after 19 months served. All of that according to encyclopedia.com. Do you remember your very first case at the Supreme Court?
You know, I don't. I was just so overwhelmed. Actually, I think for the first few years, I didn't really know what was going on, you know. But I do know that first term, the big case was Bakke. And I remember when the decision came down. I'm not sure. Well, I think I did sketch the argument.
Just briefly, the Bakke decision, formerly Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, was a 1978 ruling in which the U.S. Supreme Court declared affirmative action constitutional, but invalidated the use of racial quotas. You know, you're there for so many pivotal moments. Did you have an interest in politics prior? Is that sort of what drew you there?
Really very little. You know, I came just after Watergate, and I really didn't pay a lot of attention to Watergate. I did not have a television. I didn't have a car. I didn't listen to the radio much. So no, I had very little interest.
How many sketch artists are in the courtroom at a time? Are you alone? Is there only one designated per SCOTUS hearing?
Presently at the Supreme Court, there are 3 of us who have credentials. I'm pretty much the only one who's there for every argument, or almost every argument. When I first started out, if we were covering a trial, there were usually at least 6 sketch artists. Today in DC, there's basically just me and Bill Hennessy. And then there's a third who works for AP, but she's very seldom in court.
You're one of 2 or 3 in the world who does this work. That's crazy.
Oh, no, I wouldn't say in the world, in DC.
Okay, but SCOTUS, because there's only one, right?
There's only one SCOTUS, yes. Oh, yeah, that's right. That covers the Supreme Court, correct.
That's incredible. Do you ever stop and think about that?
I do. I have a front row seat to some, important history. So, yeah, I do.
You do, and spanning for so many years and so many pivotal change-making years. In that time, I know this is probably almost like a Sophie's Choice type of question, but is there a sketch or set of sketches so far that you're most proud of?
I'm most proud of the work that I'm doing right now. I really like the sketches that I did at the impeachment trial recently, back in January. I think I did a really good job with that.
Wow. I've got a couple of questions here, and I can come back at them in different ways if you want, but I want to know do you have a strategy when you go in? And also, do you have a sense of how much time you're going to have? And do you need to come out with a certain number of sketches?
Okay, that's 3 questions, I think. Yeah, you absolutely do need a strategy. And you have to be flexible, too, because things change quickly, and they don't always happen the way you anticipate. So, yeah, I do have a strategy. As far as time, sometimes at the Supreme Court, for example, that's easy because I know that there's an hour for argument. I know who's arguing. Supreme Court is a breeze in that sense. In a courtroom, of course, you really don't know what's going to happen. There have been hearings that take 30 seconds and others that just go on and on.
Do you just want to break your pencils when it's 30 seconds? Like, what am I supposed to do with that?
I do have this, I've always had this fantasy of just standing up in the middle of the proceedings and just telling people to just stop, or slow down, or I wish the lawyer would just draw things out a little bit more. Fortunately, a lot of court proceedings go very slowly, so that helps.
Art told me that depending on what kind of session he's covering, his strategy may differ. On big blockbuster argument days, he will have a couple of wide shots he started earlier, and once the press is in place, he will put in the foreground. There's no set number of sketches he needs to turn out, but he said he does need to do at least one wide shot, one of each of the lawyers arguing, some color sketches, and of course a few sketches of justices asking questions. He brings a few graphite pencils, an eraser, a 12 by 16 inch portfolio with paper in 2 sizes, 9 by 12 and 11 by 15. Watercolor is added later in the press room, and once the sketches are ready, he scans them, adds captions, and uploads. So the one most recently that you were talking about, the impeachment, can you tell us more about that? What was it like to be there for that? And what was your strategy in going into that?
I was a little overwhelmed. I wasn't sure exactly how it would unfold. Each day the program was a little different. And I was trying to get color as well as what happened on the floor. Actually, I wasn't as interested in what was happening on the floor of the Senate as everything that was happening around it, things happening in the press room, in the halls. So I guess I didn't really have a strategy. I was just looking for opportunities. Mm-hmm. I would go down, where the trains come in from the Senate office buildings. There are underground trains to the Capitol. Mm-hmm. And I would station myself down there with the rest of the press. And I followed the press around and, just looked for stuff to draw.
Do you ever have moments where you think, today's a really big day. I need to have no coffee today. I need to have extra coffee today. How do you approach your mornings before you know it's a really big day?
I try to tell myself it's not a really big day. I do have this thought that, today I'm just not going to be able to draw. I'm just going to lose it. Usually, as soon as I get busy, that thought goes away. But, it does occur to me.
What are your tools? What are your tools of the trade? What do you go in with? What is and isn't allowed? Have you ever brought something in that you weren't allowed to bring in unknowingly?
The tools I've used have evolved over time. There was a time when I used pastels and I also used gouache and I used colored pencils and I used markers. Today, I'm just using graphite pencil and watercolor, and it works very well for me. As far as not being allowed things, usually it's that I've forgotten something that's electronic in my bag. Sometimes we are allowed to bring electronics into the courtroom. For the Boston Marathon bombing trial, I was able to bring a scanner and an iPad in there. And I could scan my drawings and upload them without ever leaving my seat in the courtroom.
Wow. Where do you sit? Do you have an assigned seat every time? It's like that's Art's seat.
At the Supreme Court, I do. I have my regular seat. But, of course, in the courtroom, it's, if it's a long trial, usually you'll sort of, get a seat, a regular seat. Recently, the Manafort trial, the judge there was, it made life very difficult for us. And he insisted that there were no reserved seats for anyone in the courtroom. And that caused us to have to line up at 5 o'clock in the morning and, just crowd around the doors. And there were no seats even for for Manafort's family. But, we worked it out.
I have no concept of the capacity of a Supreme Court hearing. How many people can be there? Is there a maximum total, including the justices, the attorneys, yourself? Are there a lot of people? I don't even have an idea.
I should be able to tell you that. SCOTUS blog just did a series on that earlier this year. I know that there are 50 seats open to the public, and very often people line up sometimes days in advance.
Wow.
And sleep on the sidewalks, around the court.
I looked up the article on SCOTUS blog, where you'll also see sketches made by Art of an empty Supreme Court, where you can see where everyone sits, from the justice's bench to the marshal's seat to the arguing counsel tables to pressed public gallery. You have to check it out. So on the question of capacity, SCOTUS blog says, on average argument days at the Supreme Court, there are 439 seats in the courtroom. Of those 439, only 50, as Art said, are specifically set aside for members of the general public. The other 389 are divided among several different groups. It seems like there's so much decorum, which is appropriate in the United States Supreme Court. But have you seen many instances of a break in that, whether it's exchanges between the justices or other people in the court, where it ended up being something completely apart from decorum?
Usually decorum is maintained, but occasionally, it seems like every 5 years or so, there is an outburst. Now, I guess it's also a breach of decorum when somebody sneaks a camera in, and that's happened a few times recently.
Was that a still camera or a video camera? Do you know?
It had to be a little camera and a pen or something like that.
Huh.
It's a video that appeared later. I've often thought, that eventually I think they will have cameras in the Supreme Court. And for a while there, I was thinking, it's not really a matter of choice. It's just going to become a fact. People will have cameras,
Mm-hmm.
That's when Google Glasses first came out. I thought everybody's going to have Google Glasses.
Yeah.
Of course, that didn't happen. But as far as the decorum, you have to wear a jacket and tie. The public doesn't, but the press certainly does. I was stopped one time for wearing a pair of black jeans. They told me that was inappropriate. So.
Jeans are not allowed.
No, not for men.
Interesting. Were there any memorable outbursts over these years?
Oh, sure. Quite a few. I think the most memorable was Larry Flynt.
What happened?
He was brought into the court. It was his case, Hustler. And he started yelling out in the middle of the court. Actually, I won't repeat it because it was a bit of an obscenity.
Oh?
They hustle somebody out of there very quickly when that happens.
The Washington Post headline from November 9th, 1983 reads, Flynt arrested after cursing Supreme Court. I have to read some of this to you. Chief Justice Warren E. Burger ordered magazine publisher Larry Flynt arrested yesterday after he began screaming obscenities at the Supreme Court from his gold-plated wheelchair at the rear of the ornate courtroom. Blank, this court. You denied me my counsel of choice, Flint shouted at the seemingly startled justices. It goes on to say that the incident, unprecedented in court history, according to the court spokesman, occurred moments after the justices heard arguments in a libel case involving Flint, publisher of the pornographic magazine, Hustler. So right now, during this COVID time, how has your life changed? When's the last time you set foot in the Supreme Court?
I actually went in the building once this summer, and it was very strange because everything was closed. There was nobody in there. I think I saw one guard in the building. So it's odd. They've resumed arguments, and they're doing the arguments by telephone conference. And what I'm doing now is the lawyers who are arguing their case will send me a photograph of themselves arguing, either from their kitchen or their law firm or law school. And I base my sketches from that. And it's actually been a lot of fun to actually, instead of having to draw lawyers in suits and ties, and they're sometimes in hoodies and sweatshirts. So that's kind of been fun.
Has anybody in pajamas?
Nobody in pajamas yet, but I'm hoping.
How strange.
SCOTUS blog writes to all of them and asks them if they could submit a photograph of their setup. And sometimes they take a picture before the actual argument. Sometimes they'll have somebody take a picture during the argument.
Wow. So let's talk about SCOTUS blog. What is SCOTUS blog, and what do you do with SCOTUS blog?
Well, I've been working for them for about 5 years now, and just really love it. It's so different from television news, where the sketch just gets thrown up there for 3 seconds and is gone. Mm-hmm. They use just about everything I do, and they cover every argument at the Supreme Court. It's just a great resource. And what I love the most is I've started doing the banner for SCOTUS blog, where their logo is over a picture, and it's a long, horizontal, a long strip across the top. And I have to fit a drawing into that. And it allows me to use my imagination. I think I was just sort of doing sketches of people in line outside. And then one day on the way to court, there was a case called Yates. It was a Sarbanes-Oxley case that came out of Enron about a fisherman who had gotten rid of his illegal catch, and he was charged under a law that made it a crime to destroy evidence. And, usually applied to paperwork, Mm-hmm. And so I did a sketch very quickly of all the justices dressed up as fishermen.
Oh, is that on SCOTUSblog.com?
It was on SCOTUS blog. I'd be happy to send you an image file.
I'd love to be able to share it with the listeners.
Okay.
Because we only ever see them, well, with a few exceptions, we almost only ever see the justices in their robes. And then
right.
That makes me think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and we did see her in her T-shirt with her dumbbells and barbells and training. And that in conjunction with your mention of the banners that you create, you made such a beautiful sketch that showed her many different types of collars that she would wear after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. Was that something that you did impromptu for yourself? Was that for SCOTUS blog?
The night that I heard that she had died, I knew I had to come up with something by morning. And for some reason, that was the first thing that popped into mind. I had been thinking for a long time, and I was hoping to do some sketches of her collars. So maybe that's why I thought of that. But
it was really beautiful.
Thank you.
And that makes me wonder, with the amount of years that you've been there and the amount of time the Supreme Court justices spend there, did you and have you had a chance to create relationships with any of them? Did you happen to have any kind of relationship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
No, I really didn't. I don't have much contact with the justices. I just remember her once coming down to the press room, but otherwise not really. When Justice Stevens retired, the press had a lunch for him, and we gave him a sketch that I had done, and he was really very thankful and very nice about that.
As a sketch artist, when you look at people, do you see people the way other people see people? Or do you imagine how you would quickly get the shape of the face and the shape of the eyes and the bend of the nose? And I just imagine you must look at the world a bit differently than people who don't do what you do.
I think I probably do look at it differently. Sometimes I think I can draw without actually drawing. You know what I mean? I'm looking at how I would draw that person.
Do you think you have a bit of a photographic memory?
No, I don't.
Do you have an awareness of doing that when you look at people? Like, for example, when you're not in the courtroom and you meet someone, are you thinking how you'd sketch them? Sometimes
I do, yeah. I mean, I definitely put people in, oh, this is a person with that kind of feature or that kind of face. And, yeah, I think I do have there are shapes, you're looking for shapes and relationships. And
oh, right. Relationships, distance from nose to mouth or between the eyes. Or
what is interesting is lately the facial recognition stuff, that's sort of made me more aware of what I'm looking for. When you see the way that facial recognition works and it's really just a matter of distances and relationships. And so it's sort of like, okay, so the likeness is not all in that nose. It's like also, where it is on the face. And
do you do sketches for friends or family as gifts, that kind of thing? Or do people ever ask you, hey, instead of a family portrait, would you sketch us our family portrait?
I do. I prefer to do it when I just sort of do it impromptu.
Mm-hmm.
I do get asked from time to time, and my wife has learned not to volunteer me anymore.
I'm not for hire.
Right.
This is a passion, and it's a hobby, and it's not in between.
Yeah. But I do, at my niece's wedding, I certainly will do some sketches and things like that.
I wondered if Art ever feels the need to change his materials or approach when he sketches in the Supreme Court. Here's what he said.
I've been there a long time, so I kind of have to find a way to come to it with fresh eyes every now and then.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing I did was I changed my seat probably halfway through. After 20 years of being in one seat, I moved 6 feet.
So, you literally changed your perspective.
But it did change everything, And the first seat I had, I could really see the lawyer arguing much better. But the justices, some of the ones close to me, I was sort of like below them, and they were partially obscured by the bench. And then all of a sudden, over time, I realized that really the story is the justices and the questions they're asking. The lawyer really, it doesn't, is not that important. So I moved to another seat where mainly I'm seeing the lawyer from behind, but I have a clear view of all the justices.
And was that a process to be able to get your seat changed?
It wasn't difficult because I started out sitting where all the other artists had always sat, because everybody was trying to draw the lawyer, because that's the new face, everybody knows what the justices look like. But then when I realized, first of all, NBC wasn't using any of my sketches of the lawyer,
Okay.
It was always like Justice so-and-so asked and Justice so-and-so said. So I realized the emphasis was really on the justices. So when I moved to a seat, it was in another alcove, and no sketch artists had been sitting there. So
that's really cool. They talk about photographers. If you want something different, that's not necessarily what you do with the camera. You need to move your body. So that's interesting. You kind of did the same thing.
The other thing I discovered over time is that the best seat is not always the best seat. Trying to guess, we're always looking before getting into a courtroom. Sometimes the doors will be closed and we can't really see the setup inside. But usually you want to be on the side where the jury box is so that you get a diagonal view of the defendant. They usually sit the defendant at the far table, not next to the jury, but further away. So you're always shooting for that side of the courtroom. But, things change, especially today when they have big monitors in the courtroom and they move those around. So you never really can be sure, which seat is going to turn out to be the best.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Can we go back a little bit and talk about how you got here? What were you like as a kiddo? Did you draw?
I drew a lot as a kid when I was very young. I remember getting one of those books on how to draw horses. I did that for a long time. I mean, that's when I was really little. And, I was raised by a single mom, and we moved to Geneva, Switzerland. And my mother's French. She put me in public school there, and nobody spoke English. I did speak French. I was born in New York City. Mm-hmm. And, I sat in the back of the room, and basically for the better part of that first year, I just drew things. And my teacher would come and write the word down for that object in French. And that was sort of, my assignment. That was in elementary school, of course. But
wow. So what kinds of things would you draw, and what kinds of things did your teacher come and show you the French words for?
Oh, I draw things like bats, and cars and submarines and, things like that.
And then, so how did you move forward from that? So you're sketching as a little guy in the back of the room, and now you're in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I don't know. Just by luck. By the time I got into high school, I really wasn't interested in drawing anymore. I did some stuff, but really not much. And I just sort of, I got through high school and didn't know what I wanted to pursue. And so I just sort of applied to art school, because that's something I could do. And by the time I graduated from art school, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. I was, painting houses, tarring roofs, and things like that. So I really just fell into it.
Since you fell into it, has it felt like it's been a straight line of knowing where you wanted to be and what you wanted to do? Were there any times in there where you thought, you know what, I'm not going to do this for a while, but then you came back to it?
Well, I've often, gotten frustrated. It's not really easy, but I think it's something that I do really well. So, there's a certain joy in doing something you do well. Now, there was a period where, it wasn't my choice, but NBC terminated my contract for about 4 or 5 years. So I had a little hiatus in there, which was actually a very good thing for me.
And how was it a good thing for you? It probably wasn't welcome, I would imagine.
No, actually, by then I had some serious substance abuse and alcohol problems that I had developed. And just a lot of things in my life were really going wrong. And this gave me the opportunity, and it seemed like losing my job was just, one more thing. Mm-hmm. But I have a very good friend who said, when I told him, oh man, I lost my job. And he said, Artie, that's great. And, actually it was a great thing. It gave me a chance to pull back and basically change everything in my life. And it's been great.
Wow. And did it feel like a new day when you came back?
It did. Well, here's the weird thing. I never burned any bridges with NBC, and I still, I occasionally would do a freelance job for them. The day they called me to come into the office and come back on contract was that morning. I was on my way into NBC when the Murrow, Oklahoma City Murrow building was bombed. Mm-hmm. So, all of a sudden there was this huge trial coming up.
Right back in it.
Yeah.
Wow. Is there any certain pinch me moment that you've had throughout the course of your SCOTUS sketching career that it's just the pinnacle moment, just nothing has compared to it for you? And it can be very much on a personal level. It doesn't have to necessarily be related to the content of what was being discussed or who was present, but just for you personally.
The hardest thing I did at the Supreme Court were the Affordable Care Act arguments. I think it was 2 days of arguments, but it seems like it was 3 or 4. And I can't really remember anymore. Mm-hmm. But what I do remember, it was very hard. It was just total. I mean, there were arguments in the morning, in the afternoon. It was just crazy. And the very first day, the Solicitor General, Donald Verrilli, started his first argument and he choked. He was tripped up. And I think literally he had tried to take a drink of water and it had sort of gone down the wrong way and it was enough to throw him off. And everybody after that first stage just thought, oh my God, this whole thing is in trouble. Obamacare, it's going down. And what's interesting is a lot of the top super lawyers that argue at the Supreme Court, some of them argue without any notes. And so they have a lectern that's completely bare. And I noticed that first day, there was nothing on his lectern. And the second day he came back, he recovered, and he actually was very good on the second day. And I noticed on the second day there were notes on the lectern,
just in case.
Yeah, so that was interesting. So I think that stands out probably as the strongest memory in the Supreme Court. Something I'm kind of proud of gotten through, and and of course when the decision finally did come down, again it was quite a surprise.
Apart from having to create a sketch, you're sitting in there as a professional, but you're also sitting in there as a human being. And I just wonder, are there moments while you've been sitting in there where you hear something where you think, I never learned that before, or that's a piece of wisdom that's speaking to me today, or that gave me new perspective on this thing that's happening in my life today? I'm just thinking kind of like words of wisdom or moments that you've been able to take out of there as a human being, in addition to the sketches that you bring out.
Yeah, there have been moments like that. I'm just trying to come up with a particular one right now. I have been tremendously impressed, especially at the Supreme Court, the way they sort of dissect things, But a lot of times I hear things from the bench that totally baffle me. I remember one judge saying that that's a bow and arrow question, and I've never figured out what a bow and arrow question is.
Before I ask my final question, I want to ask where people can find you online, whether it's the blog or Twitter or elsewhere.
I'm on Twitter. It's at courtartist. I do have a blog, and it's courtartist.com. My drawings are on SCOTUS blog.
So what do the words "another door opens" mean to you, if anything?
Another door opens means quite a bit to me. I found that there came a time in my life when everything was really going wrong, and I was pretty well beat down. And I found that when I finally surrendered and, admitted that I was pretty much helpless and needed help, a door did open for me. And I found since then that the more I can surrender, the more opportunities there are. So, yeah, it's been an important part of my growth.
Thank you, Art Lien, for sharing a fascinating glimpse inside the courts and your experiences there, as well as the insights you shared about some personal trials and how you found your way through them by learning to surrender. Make sure you follow Art on Twitter at courtartist and at SCOTUS blog, and also check out the SCOTUS blog website, www.scotusblog.com. I'm going to be posting some of Art's work on my social media pages too. So on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, follow us at podcastado. That's podcast ADO. The Another Door Opens podcast is about open doors, open hearts, and open minds. Through this podcast and the people I talk with here, I feel it's one small way we can participate in celebrating differences and finding common ground at the same time. Please drop me a note about what you like about the podcast or want more of, and I'll try to do my best to keep making it better. I do this on my own time, and my intention is to provide you with as much value as possible. To my Patreon supporters, thank you for believing in this podcast and backing it. If you're interested in becoming a patron too, you can go to patreon.com/anotherdoropens to find out some of the options there, starting at $1 a month, and some of the perks that go with it. I invite you to rate and review the podcast as well. Those Another Door Opens beats you hear every week are by the amazing Eric Brown. And that is the final brushstroke on this week's episode of the Another Door Opens podcast. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next week. Love you. Bye.